The moment my father cleared his throat, the dining room grew so still I could hear the soft crackle of the rosemary candles on the table. It was Christmas dinner in Ridgewater, Montana, and the house was packed with aunts, uncles, cousins, people who'd known me my whole life. The gravy boat hadn't even made it halfway around the table when he lifted his glass and said the words that would split something open inside me. Compared to your sister, he announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "You are a failure." Forks froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. A few cousins shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us as if waiting for a punchline. But there wasn't one. My father kept talking, praising Olivia, calling her the pride of the family, the shining star, the one who made them proud. And I stayed still, perfectly silent. Because in that silence lived 8 years of sacrifices that nobody at that table even knew existed. The debts I had paid, the house I had saved, the dreams I had funded that Olivia now bragged about as if they'd come from her own hard work. I sat there with a smile so tight it felt like it might shatter. And I think that was the exact moment something inside me began to burn. My mother avoided my eyes, stirring her cranberry sauce with a trembling spoon. She didn't rush to defend me or soften the blow. She simply let the words settle in the room like smoke. Olivia, in her shimmering silver dress, shifted in her seat and offered a small, embarrassed smile, but not embarrassed enough to stop enjoying the spotlight. She lowered her lashes as if modest, but I could see the pride in the soft curve of her lips. The cousins resumed their conversations, careful, controlled chatter as if pretending nothing had happened would erase it. My father leaned closer to Olivia, asking about her latest brand partnerships and her growing follower count. His voice rose with pride every time he said her name. I sat halfway down the table with a glass of eggnog cooling in my hand, tasting bitterness where sweetness should have been. The fire popped in the living room louder than usual, as if it had its own opinion about what had just unfolded. Aunt Lily attempted a polite smile in my direction, but even that fizzled quickly when she saw my father watching her. I felt heat climbing up my neck, but I kept my posture steady, my hands tight on my napkin. If I spoke, if I broke, I knew they would see it as proof that he was right. So I stayed quiet, swallowed the sting, and let my silence speak for me. But silence can only muffle so much. Behind my stillness, memories began to rise, sharp, vivid, merciless. I thought of the winter Olivia nearly dropped out of college because she couldn't pay her tuition the night she called me crying, saying she'd lose everything. I was 26 then, drowning in a spreadsheet of numbers at my Seattle office, exhausted from 14-hour days. I wired the money without hesitation. She promised she'd pay me back someday. She never did. Then came the spring. My parents told me they might lose the house. A forgotten repair loan had spiraled out of control. They were terrified the bank would seize everything. I had just managed to build a modest savings account after years of living on canned soup and clearance rack clothes. I drained it in a single afternoon. My father thanked me once, then acted like he'd fixed the whole crisis himself. I thought of the camera equipment I bought for Olivia when she said her career depended on it. The flights I covered when she claimed a brand might work with her. The late-night transfers when Mom and Dad whispered, "Just this one last time." None of it mattered now. Not at this table. Not in this house. My father raised his glass again, toasting Olivia for her hard-earned success. Laughter erupted around her, warm and glowing, filling the corners of the room. I stared at the white tablecloth patterned with holly leaves and wondered what it would feel like just once to be the daughter worth celebrating. My chest tightened with a familiar ache, the kind that comes from years of being unseen, years of convincing yourself that if you just give a little more sacrifice, a little more, they will finally notice. But they never did. Aunt Lily's eyes met mine again. This time there was sympathy in the slant of her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd seen what happened. But sympathy from one person could never drown out the chorus of silence from everyone else. My father's voice boomed across the table once more. To Olivia, our star, glasses clinked. Cheers rose. Olivia beamed. I took another sip of my eggnog, forcing it down past the tightness in my throat. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind him of the bills I paid the nights I worked late, the years I held our family's life together with money I didn't have to spare. Instead, I sat there and let every cruel syllable burn itself into me. Because deep down, I knew something my father didn't. The night he called me a failure was the night I finally stopped being one. The cold air outside my parents' house felt sharper than it should have for late December, slicing against my skin as I stepped onto the back porch after dinner. Snow crunched beneath my boots, and for a moment, I just stood there staring at the dim outline of the Ridgewater Lake frozen solid in the distance. Laughter still drifted from the dining room behind me, warm, bright, lively, completely untouched by the humiliation I had just swallowed. I pulled my coat tighter and breathed in the bitter wind, letting it sting my lungs. Anything was better than the suffocating heat of that dining room where everyone pretended nothing had happened. I didn't want to cry. Not here. Not where they could see it. The porch light flickered as the back door opened. My mother stepped out, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her breath clouding the air in small white puffs. For a moment I thought maybe she'd come to check on me to offer some soft form of comfort. Maybe she had seen the way my father's words cut me and would finally say something, anything, in my defense. Instead, she sighed, brushing a bit of snow off the railing. "Your father didn't mean it the way it sounded," she murmured, avoiding my eyes. "You know how he gets when he's proud of Olivia." I laughed under my breath, short and humorless. "He called me a failure mom." She flinched, but only slightly. "Well, he can be harsh, but Olivia really is doing so well. She's under a lot of pressure. She needs our support. Our support, not mine alone." Yet I was the only one who had been giving it. I looked at her, trying to read anything in her face. Guilt, remorse, even discomfort, but all I saw was resignation, as if this was simply the natural order of things. Olivia needed, and I gave. Olivia shined, and I stayed in the shadows. Olivia was the pride, and I was the steady background character nobody applauded. Her eyes flicked back toward the window, watching the warm glow of the chandelier, and the figures laughing inside. "This is just who your father is," she said finally, her voice low. "Don't let it bother you." But it did. And not because of the words themselves, but because of everything she wasn't saying, everything she had chosen not to see for years. I let her words dissolve into the cold air. She hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for me to agree, then slipped back inside, letting the door click shut with finality. I stayed outside longer, letting the silence settle around me. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, melting as they touched my cheeks. I didn't wipe them away. I just stared at the frozen lake, its surface reflecting the faint moonlight like a sheet of unbroken glass, and wondered when exactly I had become invisible in my own family. Eventually, the cold forced me back inside. The warmth of the house felt suffocating as I slipped quietly past the dining room. No one noticed me. They were too busy talking about Olivia's latest photo shoot, her upcoming collaborations, her bright future. The same conversation recycled and repeated year after year. I grabbed my coat and bag from the entryway and slipped out the front door without a word. They didn't hear it close behind me. The walk to the Ridgewater station was short, the streets empty except for holiday lights blinking weakly along the rooftops. By the time I reached the platform, snow had begun falling steadily again, casting everything in a soft blur. The train arrived with a low rumble, and I stepped inside, grateful for the quiet. The car was nearly empty, just an older man asleep near the front, and a young couple whispering to each other in the back. I sank into a window seat, pressed my forehead against the cool glass, and exhaled slowly. For the first time all night, I let myself think. I thought of my father's pride-swollen smile as he praised Olivia, the sparkle of her sequined dress, catching the light like a beacon. I thought of how no one, not one single person, had spoken up for me. Not even my mother, who used to tell me when I was a kid that I was her steady one, her dependable one. Dependable. I had always hated that word. It meant I was the person everyone leaned on, but never looked at. The train lurched forward, wheels grinding softly against the tracks. Ridgewater's glowing streets slipped away behind me. I closed my eyes, but the memories didn't stop. The years of late-night wire transfers, the frantic calls from my parents saying they had miscalculated a bill or forgotten a deadline. Olivia crying over a tuition payment she'd completely forgotten about. The camera equipment she desperately needed to keep her brand alive. The dozens of quiet rescues I had carried out without question, without thanks, without acknowledgement. My breath fogged the window as the train picked up speed. In the dark reflection of the glass, I saw my own face, tired, pale, older than 30 should feel. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, not entirely. I opened my laptop, not sure why, maybe out of instinct or desperation. On the screen was a folder I had created years ago, Financial Records Family. I clicked it open, and thousands of dollars worth of payments spilled across the screen in neatly labeled rows. Looking at it all at once made my stomach twist. Tuition, credit card bailouts, home repairs, emergency medical bills, equipment, travel, subscriptions, loans. The total at the bottom made my breath catch. $92,000. Almost 3 years of my life poured into keeping my family stable, keeping my sister shining. And they still called me a failure. A hollow ache spread through my chest. For the first time, I let the truth land fully. They didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for what I could give them. The rhythm of the train softened as it crossed a bridge over the frozen river. I watched the reflection of the moon ripple across the dark water and felt something shift inside me. Something small, quiet, but undeniable. A single thought rose, fragile and daring. What would happen if I stopped? I closed the laptop gently, my fingers trembling, and leaned back against the seat, letting the idea settle like a spark waiting for oxygen. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the faintest pulse of strength, the kind that had been buried for years under everyone else's needs. And for the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to put myself first. The train hummed beneath me as it cut through the frozen Montana landscape, each mile putting more distance between me and the dining room where my father had declared my worth to a room full of relatives. Snow streaked past the window in silver blurs. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around me, not comforting exactly, but steady like a breath I had been holding for years, was finally beginning to loosen. I opened my laptop again, though my hands trembled as I touched the keys. The spreadsheet glowed on the screen, rows upon rows of numbers stretching back nearly a decade. Payments I had made, emergencies I had covered, mistakes I had cleaned up. I had tracked everything only because I needed to keep my finances afloat. I never meant for the file to become a record of a life spent in the shadows. The total at the bottom stared back at me like a verdict. $92, $480. I whispered the number under my breath, the digits tasting bitter on my tongue. It wasn't just money, it was time, stress, missed opportunities. Nights I had chosen work over rest. Months when I couldn't afford decent groceries because another one of Olivia's urgent bills had landed in my inbox. The spreadsheet flickered as the train passed under a bridge, shadows trailing across the screen. I scrolled through the entries again, each one tugging me back to the moment it happened. March 2015. Olivia's tuition payment. $800. She had called me sobbing, claiming her financial aid was delayed and she'd get kicked out if she didn't pay immediately. I was 24, barely keeping up with my own rent, but I told her I would handle it. July 2017. Credit card payment. Dad's second overdue card, $2,700. He had brushed it off like it was nothing. Just a little mix-up, he'd said. You're good with numbers. Help your old man out. And I did. Always. February 2018. Ridgewater home repair loan, $11,200. My parents had hidden the debt from me until the roof nearly collapsed. I drained the savings I had put aside for my Seattle move. My father boasted that he had finally handled the house repairs, never once mentioning the check I had written. September 2020. Camera equipment set Olivia's investment in herself $1,900. She had promised she'd pay me back once her brand took off. It never did. I exhaled shakily and closed my eyes. Each memory struck like a match, and for the first time I felt the heat of anger instead of guilt. I opened my eyes to my reflection in the train window, tired, yes, but steadier than before. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. From clarity. Pure, startling clarity. A thought took shape inside me, fragile yet fierce. If I stopped paying, they would be forced to stand on their own. I whispered it out loud, voice barely audible over the hum of the train. What would happen if I stopped? My reflection stared back at me, eyes wide, as if the question itself had peeled back a layer of my life I had never dared to examine. I had spent so many years believing that family loyalty meant sacrifice without limits. That love meant stepping in again and again until my own life shrank small enough to hide behind Olivia's curated perfection. But what if it didn't? The thought lingered in my chest like a stubborn ember refusing to die out. The conductor's announcement crackled overhead, calling out the next station, though I barely heard it. My pulse was loud, insistent. I pressed my hand to my chest, not to calm my heart, but to steady the realization forming beneath my ribs. I had been carrying a family that never turned around to see if I was struggling under the weight. They didn't ask if I could afford another emergency. They didn't ask if I was tired. They didn't ask if their needs were draining the life out of me. They only asked if I could send the money by Friday. The train slowed as it approached a small town, the lights flickering past the windows like constellations scattered across the snow. I glanced around the car. The older man snored softly. The couple at the back pressed their foreheads together, whispering love-soaked secrets. Life was moving on around me while I sat frozen in a life that wasn't mine. I closed the spreadsheet and shut the laptop, feeling the weight of that single decision. Not a plan, not a strategy, just the tiniest shift. Maybe I didn't have to fix everything anymore. The idea felt terrifying and freeing. Outside, the sun rose in pink streaks against the winter sky. The landscape blurred again as the train picked up speed heading west. My breath fogged the window, and for a moment it felt like the world might be giving me permission to breathe again. I rested my head against the cool glass and let my shoulders slump for the first time in years. My phone buzzed in my bag. Probably Olivia or my parents, but I didn't reach for it. They could wait. They had taken enough. The train curved along the riverbank, the frozen water glittering beneath the morning light. I watched it pass, letting the stillness soak into me. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel guilty for wanting to protect myself. Instead, I felt something else, something quiet, but unmistakably alive. Hope. Not the kind built on someone else's expectations, but the kind that grows like a seed in the cracked soil of a life finally being reclaimed. As the train sped toward Seattle, I leaned back in my seat and whispered almost a vow I'm done being their safety net. The words didn't feel dangerous. They felt like the truth. Seattle's skyline appeared through the frost-covered train window like a promise cold, distant, but unmistakably mine. As the train slid into the station, the weight of Ridgewater slipped further behind me, though the echo of my father's voice clung stubbornly to the edges of my thoughts. Compared to your sister, you are a failure. The words followed me through the platform, up the station stairs, and all the way to the street where a bitter wind hit my face like a slap. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had faded into a pale winter gray. I dropped my bag on the couch and stood in the center of the room, letting the silence settle around me. It felt strange, too quiet, too still, but it was better than the noise of being overlooked. Better than pretending everything was fine. I made myself a cup of tea, though my hands shook so badly I nearly spilled it. I didn't sit. I didn't take off my coat. I simply walked to my small dining table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the spreadsheet I had stared at for miles on the train. Rows and columns glowed across the screen, each line a memory I had tried not to revisit. Tuition, credit cards, Late fees, flights, equipment, the house repair loan. Every sacrifice laid out in black and white. I scrolled to the bottom again. The total burned like a brand. $92,000. A hollow trembling filled my chest. Not from fear this time, but from the dawning realization that I couldn't keep doing this. Not physically, not financially, not emotionally. My eyes drifted back to the top of the spreadsheet to the very first payment nearly 8 years ago. I remembered Olivia's frantic call, the way she said she couldn't breathe, the way she begged me not to tell our parents she'd fallen behind. I had covered the payment without hesitation, thinking it was a one-time emergency. But emergencies had become patterns. Patterns had become expectations. And expectations had become chains I hadn't realized I was wearing until now. A soft knock suddenly came from the other side of the wall, the elderly neighbor probably letting her dog out into the hallway. The sound jolted me back to myself. I sank into the chair, tea steaming in front of me, and let the weight of everything settle over my shoulders. The memories came slow and sharp. The month I'd skipped groceries to pay my father's credit card. The night Olivia posted photos from a hotel room I had paid for. The time my parents told relatives they'd taken care of the house repairs, never mentioning my drained savings. The holidays I brought gifts, but received nothing more than polite smiles. The way my father ignored me at the dinner table while praising Olivia's every breath. A deep ache formed behind my ribs, throbbing like a bruise. But beneath it, something steadier was growing. A flicker of anger, quiet, controlled, long overdue. Why had I accepted all of it without a fight? The answer came to me slowly, like a truth I'd spent years avoiding. Because I thought love meant giving until it hurt. I pressed my fingertips to my temples. The room felt too small, too tight. The walls seemed to pulse with memories I wanted to forget. I stood abruptly, pacing the narrow strip of hardwood between the couch and the kitchen. The question I'd whispered on the train rose again, louder this time. What if I stopped? The idea was terrifying. My family had always treated me like the dependable one, the one who stepped in, cleaned up, fixed everything quietly. If I pulled away, if I let them stand on their own, what would happen? My mind conjured the image of the Ridgewater house, the way the porch sagged until I fixed the loan, the bills that piled up, until I paid them the vacations they took while I saved every spare dollar. Would the house fall apart without me? Would Olivia's career crumble? Would my parents finally face the debt they kept hiding behind smiles? An unexpected calm washed over me. For years, I had been the invisible glue holding everything together. Maybe it was time to let the pieces fall where they belonged. I returned to the table, opened another file, the one marked Financial Documents, Home, and clicked through photos I'd saved, copies of checks, loan statements with my name listed as guarantor, emails confirming payments I'd made on their behalf. It wasn't just generosity. It was responsibility they had handed to me without asking whether I could carry it. I hadn't realized how heavy it had become. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen until my eyes blurred. The number at the bottom felt like a verdict and a warning. I couldn't keep doing this. A sudden vibration from my phone made me jump. A message from my assistant at work, a reminder about the quarterly review. I typed a quick reply and set the phone face down. Work was the one place where people saw me, valued me, where silence didn't make me vanish. But at home, silence made me a ghost. I closed the laptop slowly and rested my hands on it, feeling the hum of heat still trapped inside. A pulse of determination tightened in my chest. Tomorrow I would talk to someone. Daniel. Maybe even Aunt Caroline. Someone who could help me understand the legal pieces of everything I'd been tied to without truly agreeing. Tonight, I would sit in the quiet and let the truth settle. I wasn't a failure. I was exhausted, and something needed to change. Daniel noticed the moment I walked into the office the next morning. I didn't even make it to my desk before he stepped into my path holding a coffee with my name scribbled on the side in his messy handwriting. "You look like you went 12 rounds with a freight train," he said gently. His tone wasn't mocking, it was concerned. I tried to smile, but it came out thin. "Christmas," I said simply. He didn't push. Not yet. He just handed me the coffee and nodded toward the small lounge near the window, the one place in the building where fluorescent lights didn't drown out the early morning skyline. I followed him not because I was ready to talk, but because something inside me needed to. We sat in the corner armchairs, the city stretching behind us like a steel ocean. I felt his eyes on me, waiting. The words lodged in my chest for a moment before they started spilling out. I told him everything. The dinner table. My father's voice slicing through the room. The silence that smothered me afterward. The years of payments, quiet rescues, emergency transfers. The lake house repairs, Olivia's camera equipment, the tuition payments I had pretended didn't hurt. I told him about the spreadsheet, the one with nearly $100,000 laid bare like bones. By the time I stopped talking, the coffee in my hands had gone cold. Daniel sat forward, elbows on his knees, jaw tight with anger I hadn't expected to see on his face. "Rachel," he said slowly, "this isn't just unfair. This is abuse." The word hit me like a shock. I blinked at him. "It's family," I whispered, defensive out of habit. He shook his head sharply. "That doesn't make it any less abusive. They've conditioned you to think your value is in what you give them. That's not love. That's exploitation." The truth of it cracked open inside me. I had known deep down, but hearing it aloud from someone who wasn't tangled in Ridgewater's expectations made it feel real in a way I couldn't ignore. I opened my mouth to argue, but the protest died before it reached my lips. Because he was right. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You need protection," he said. "You need someone who knows how to untangle all this. A lawyer. A lawyer?" The word sounded foreign, like something used in other people's crises, not mine. But the moment he said it, something inside me shifted. A low hum of truth. I swallowed. "I don't have anyone here." "What about family?" he pressed. "Extended family." The faces of Ridgewater flickered in my mind until one stood out, Aunt Caroline. My mother's older sister. Sharp, observant. Never fooled by the sugarcoating my parents liked to add to every story. She lived in San Diego, and I hadn't seen her in years, but whenever she looked at me, I felt seen. Daniel must have noticed the change in my expression. "Call her," he said. "Today. Before they pull you back into another mess." I hesitated, thumb brushing the edge of my coffee cup. Fear curled tight in my stomach, but another feeling curled under it, resolve. "They count on your silence," he added quietly. "Break it." That was what pushed me. I stepped out into the hallway, heart pounding, and dialed Caroline's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Rachel, honey, is everything okay?" Her voice was warm, grounding, but the moment I tried to speak, the words trembled. I forced them out anyway, telling her about the humiliation at dinner, the financial mess behind my family's perfect facade. The spreadsheet, the loans, the years I had carried what wasn't mine. There was a long, heavy pause when I finished. When she finally spoke, her tone wasn't soft. It was steel. "Rachel, what they've done is financial exploitation." My knees buckled a little and I leaned against the wall. "I just wanted to help," I whispered. "And you did," she replied firmly. "For years. But they crossed the line from needing support to depending on you like a lifeline. That's not your responsibility." The truth of her words sank deep, lodging somewhere behind my sternum, painful and liberating. She began explaining things I had never considered: my legal rights, the difference between helping and enabling, the danger of being listed as a guarantor on loans I didn't create. You need to gather everything, she said. Statements, emails, documents. And stop making payments immediately. This isn't cruelty, it's survival. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay," I breathed. "I'll do it." Before we hung up, she added one more thing, voice low and certain. If they react badly, that tells you everything you need to know about their love. When I returned to the lounge, Daniel handed me a fresh cup of hot coffee without a word. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, I felt something loosen inside me. "What's next?" he asked quietly. I took a deep breath, feeling the answer settle into place. "I'm going to meet with a lawyer," I said. Then, with more strength than I expected, "I'm done being their safety net." The morning I decided to cut the chain, Seattle was washed in pale winter sunlight, the kind that looked warm but carried no heat at all. I woke before my alarm heart-pounding mind already racing. Today wasn't a thought experiment. Today was action. Today, I would finally take my name off the debts that had tied me to Ridgewater like an anchor. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple navy sweater and black slacks, something steady enough to make me feel grounded. My hands still trembled as I gathered the folder Caroline told me to prepare: bank statements, email, confirmations, loan documents, screenshots of late-night messages from Olivia begging for one last little help. When I closed the folder, it felt heavier than its actual weight, like I was holding 8 years of my own exhaustion between my palms. Before I walked out the door, I whispered to the empty apartment, "This ends today." Saying it aloud steadied something inside me. Outside, the air bit at my cheeks as I made my way through downtown Seattle. I met Aunt Caroline in the lobby of Sullivan and Hayes LLP, a firm tucked neatly between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. She stood when she saw me, tall, elegant in a charcoal coat, her silver hair swept back in a way that made her look both warm and formidable. "Rachel," she said, touching my arm gently, "you're doing the right thing." I wasn't sure if I believed that yet, but I nodded. Inside the meeting room, the city stretched behind us through floor-to-ceiling windows. Caroline laid my folder on the table and began reviewing everything with quiet precision. Her brows furrowed at certain entries, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Your name is everywhere," she murmured. "Loans, credit lines, house repairs." "Rachel, you've been single-handedly holding your family together financially." "I know," I said softly, but I didn't realize how bad it looked until I saw it all at once. She looked up at me with something like sadness. "They've leaned on you in ways no parent or sibling should. You're not a safety net. You're their child. And they've forgotten that." The words made my throat tighten, but I held her gaze. She explained what needed to happen next, removing myself as guarantor, freezing payments, filing formal notice with the Ridgewater Bank. Then she said the words that felt like a door opening inside my chest. "You're not bound to these debts for life. You can walk away legally. And today we will." A tremor ran through me. Relief? Fear. Both. We gathered the documents and walked together through the brisk city streets toward First Cascadia Bank. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. Every step felt heavier, like I was walking toward something irreversible. Inside the bank, a young teller led us to a small office. The manager, Walter Hayes, entered, a tidy man in his 60s with glasses perched low on his nose. He shook our hands politely before Caroline slid the folder toward him. "We're here to remove Ms. Moore as guarantor," she said. Walter flipped through the papers slowly, his brow lifting slightly at the volume. After several minutes, he closed the folder and looked at me. "Ms. Moore, you're currently the sole guarantor on these accounts. Removing yourself is a significant step. Are you certain?" My heart hammered. My palms were damp, but I forced myself to breathe. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." Walter nodded and printed the forms. He placed them on the table, the papers crisp and final. Caroline touched my arm lightly. "This is your freedom," she whispered. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. For a moment I hesitated. Not because I doubted myself, but because this was the first time in years I was doing something solely for me. I signed my name. The pen scratched softly across the paper. Then again on the second form. When I set the pen down, the room felt different, lighter, quieter. Walter stamped the documents. "Approved," he said. "The bank will notify your parents within 48 hours." I exhaled, almost collapsing back into my chair. My shoulders sagged with a weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying. As we stepped outside into the cold, Caroline asked, "How do you feel?" I wrapped my coat tightly around me and looked up at the sky, like I just cut a chain I didn't know was choking me. She smiled softly. "Then you did the right thing." We walked together to the corner where traffic hummed through the icy streets. Everything looked sharper, the sun on the glass towers, the steam rising from street vents, the glitter of frost on the sidewalks. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel like it was pressing down on me. But I knew this calm wouldn't last. Back at my apartment, I placed the signed documents on the counter and stared at them, feeling both victorious and terrified. Soon my parents would receive the notices. Soon Olivia would discover her bills were no longer being covered. Soon Ridgewater would feel the tremor of a life built on my back beginning to crumble. I placed a hand over the documents. "Let them rage," I whispered to myself. "Let them panic." Because for the first time since I was old enough to help them, their choices were no longer mine to fix. The first call came just after noon. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter, vibrating hard enough to knock into my coffee mug. I froze when I saw the caller ID Dad, Ridgewater. My stomach tightened, but I let it ring. Moments later, another call came. Then another, this time from my mother. Then Olivia. Then my father again. 6 attempts in under 15 minutes. The storm had begun. By the time I finally picked up on the 7th call, my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. "Hello," I said quietly. My father didn't bother with a greeting. "What the hell did you do, Rachel?" He shouted, his voice so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "The bank called this morning. They told me you pulled every guarantee. Do you have any idea what you've set in motion?" I pressed my free hand against the counter, grounding myself. I only stopped paying for what wasn't mine to pay. There was a stunned beat of silence, followed by the sound of shuffling, like he was covering the receiver while speaking to someone beside him. I heard my mother whispering urgently. Then the line crackled again as he barked into the phone. "You're tearing this family apart." I closed my eyes, letting the accusation wash over me without sinking in. "I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm stepping back from being your financial lifeline." Before he could respond, another voice snatched the phone, Olivia's high, and panicked. "How could you do this to me?" she cried. "Midland Media just called about late invoices. They said one more missed payment and they'll end my contract. My manager is furious. Do you even realize what you've done?" I gripped the counter harder. "Olivia, I'm not responsible for your career or your bills. You're jealous," she spat, voice cracking. "That's what this is. You hate that Dad is proud of me. You want to see me fail. You want everyone to see you as the victim." Her words sliced through the line, but the sting was gone. It was like being hit by a blade that had finally dulled after years of cutting me. "Believe what you need to," I said softly. "But I'm done being your bank." She sucked in a shaky breath. "Dad said you'd always help me," she whispered. "He said you were the strong one." That single sentence struck deeper than the yelling. It was the truth laid bare, the belief beneath all the manipulation, the entitlement, the taking. They had built their lives on the assumption that I'd never walk away. Before I could respond, my father grabbed the phone again. His voice ragged now, no longer angry, but desperate. "Rachel, listen to me. Families don't abandon each other. If you keep going like this, you'll regret it." My reflection in the microwave door stared back at me. Tired eyes, but unwavering. "Family stands together," I said quietly, "when it's mutual. This has never been mutual." A sharp thud echoed through the line, something hitting the table. My mother's voice rose faintly in the background, pleading Richard calm down. Then suddenly, all 3 of them were on speaker. I could hear the frantic rustling, the clatter, the breaths. "Rachel," my mother said, her voice trembling, "we're in trouble. Real trouble. If you don't help us, the lake house, it could go into foreclosure." That's your responsibility, I replied. Rachel, please. Her voice cracked. We need you. No, I said. You need yourselves. Olivia whimpered into the phone. If I lose my sponsorships, I won't survive this. You know I can't handle all this on my own. You know I need help. You've always needed help, I said softly. And I've always given it. There was a long pause. Then my father snapped, So give it again? No. My voice was steady, final. Not this time. Silence exploded across the line. My mother inhaled sharply like she'd been struck. Olivia began to cry loud and broken, but it no longer pulled me under like it used to. My father didn't shout again. His voice when he spoke was low and tight. You're betraying us. The words were meant to wound. Instead, they clarified everything. No, I said. I'm choosing myself. The line went dead. I stared at the phone lying silent on the counter, its screen dimming until the room returned to stillness. For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt something else instead. An unfamiliar lightness. A quiet freedom. My knees didn't feel weak. My chest didn't feel crushed. I wasn't drowning in guilt. Instead, I felt like I was finally standing on solid ground after years of sinking into mud. The phone buzzed again, a voicemail, not a call. I tapped it open. Rachel, a familiar voice whispered, This is Mrs. Whitaker. I just wanted you to know people here are talking. After what happened at the bank today. Your father yelled so loud half the town heard. Folks are starting to ask questions. Real questions. I leaned against the counter, heart thudding softly. Questions meant truth. Truth meant the narrative was shifting. They're finally seeing things clearly, she continued. They're finally starting to see you. The voicemail ended. I stood there breathing slowly, the late afternoon sun inching across the kitchen floor like a quiet blessing. They could rage. They could panic. They could blame me for everything falling apart. But the truth was no longer mine to bury, and Ridgewater was beginning to uncover it. I first heard about the chaos in Ridgewater through a voicemail from my cousin Molly. Her voice was hushed, as if she didn't want anyone in town to overhear her. Rachel, she whispered, your dad caused a scene at the bank. People are starting to talk. The message ended abruptly, leaving a quiet hum in my apartment that felt heavier than the winter air pressing against the windows. I played the voicemail again, not because I needed clarity, but because it felt surreal hearing Ridgewater finally say my name for something other than a polite nod at Christmas. I sat down on the edge of my couch, my breath catching somewhere between relief and disbelief. More messages followed throughout the day, some from numbers I didn't recognize, some from people I barely knew. The words blended together. Your dad stormed into the bank yelling. They said he was demanding answers. Folks saw the foreclosure notice he slammed on the counter. I didn't know you were the one paying all those years. By evening, the story had seeped through Ridgewater like a crack in old plaster. Slow at first, then spreading wide enough for everyone to see. Caroline called just before sunset. Her tone was calm but edged with a wry understanding. Your father tried to corner the loan officer today, she said. He shouted that the bank ruined his life when they accepted your withdrawal as guarantor. I pressed a hand to my forehead. Of course he did. But here's the part he didn't expect, she continued. People were listening. People who've watched your family for years. A heaviness settled over my chest. Not guilt, but something more complicated. What are they saying? They're asking why the daughter they barely hear about, the one who lives quietly in Seattle, was holding all the financial weight. And why the daughter, who's always been praised, hasn't handled any of her own obligations. The truth exposed under the fluorescent lights of Ridgewater Community Bank had finally met daylight. Later that night, Molly called again, this time with more detail. It was almost unbelievable, she said, her voice low. Your dad kept yelling that you betrayed the family. But then Mrs. Sutter asked why he needed you to guarantee the house repairs in the first place, and why Olivia's expenses were in your name. He couldn't answer. He just kept shouting. Her silence on the line felt loaded, like she was choosing her next words carefully. People aren't seeing you the way they used to, she added. They're seeing you now. Really seeing you. I didn't know what to say. Thank you didn't feel big enough, but it was all I managed. My voice cracked in the middle, and I hoped she didn't hear it. The next morning, news reached me again, this time through social media. Ridgewater's tiny community Facebook page was buzzing. Someone had posted that the Moore family's lake house was facing foreclosure. The comments were swift. Didn't Rachel save that place years ago? I always wondered how they afforded everything. Olivia's trips were paid by family money. Seriously, that girl worked her tail off in Seattle and never bragged once. I scrolled through the comments with a numb sort of shock. Years of invisibility had taught me not to expect recognition from anyone in that town. And yet here it was, people piecing together the truth I had carried alone for so long. When I checked Olivia's online profiles out of curiosity, I saw she'd posted fewer and fewer updates. Her most recent story was a blurry photo with a caption trying to stay strong. Comments flooded in asking what was happening, why she hadn't posted new brand partnerships, what she meant by family difficulties. More troubling were the rumors creeping into her tagged photos, questions about how she had funded her earlier trips, murmurs about family money, quiet accusations that she had lied about being self-made. She turned the comments off within hours. I closed the app with a long exhale. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not victory. Something deeper, maybe the beginning of closure. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Mrs. Whitaker, an old neighbor who used to sneak me extra cookies during potlucks. Her voice was soft but steady. I want you to know something, dear, she said. People in town, they're ashamed they didn't see sooner. You were always the responsible one, the quiet one. We thought you were just living your life in Seattle. We didn't realize you were keeping your whole family afloat. Her words pressed something warm and painful against my heart. I never wanted credit, I said. I just wanted fairness. And you deserve it, she replied firmly. Every bit of it. When the call ended, I stood at my window watching snow gather on the edges of the fire escape. For the first time, Ridgewater wasn't a place where I was small or unseen. It was a place finally acknowledging the truth, even if through whispers, rumors, and bank notices. My phone buzzed once more. An email. The subject line made my breath catch. Final notice foreclosure proceedings initiated. I opened it slowly. The Ridgewater Bank had issued the formal notice. 14 days until the lake house, my family's pride, their symbol of perfection, would be listed for auction unless the debt was cleared. I stared at the letter, feeling neither guilt nor triumph, just inevitability. The house was collapsing because I wasn't holding it up. And for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like truth finally standing on its own. The foreclosure notice sat open on my laptop screen, its bold black lettering stark against the white background. 14 days. That was all the time my parents had before the Ridgewater Lake House, the place they bragged about at every family gathering, would be seized and sold at auction. I stared at the words until they blurred. Not because I was shocked, but because this was the first time I'd seen the consequences land where they were supposed to. So this is what happens when I stop rescuing them, I whispered. Meanwhile, in Ridgewater, everything unraveled exactly the way I had always known it would. From what neighbors told me later, Thomas marched around the lake house like a man possessed. He slammed doors, made frantic phone calls, and paced through the living room muttering numbers under his breath. Linda followed close behind, wringing her hands and trying to calm him, but her own voice shook with panic. Olivia stood in the corner, pale, holding her phone like a lifeline, while notifications from sponsors and followers flashed across the screen. I didn't have to be there to imagine the scene. I'd lived through smaller versions of it for years. Crises they created, chaos they fueled, and the inevitable moment when they'd look at me to fix everything. But I wasn't there this time. and they had finally run out of me. While the foreclosure notice circulated quietly through Ridgewater, the town responded with the same speed it used to spread news about church fundraisers and bake sales. At the general store, people whispered about the Moore's finances. At the church, members murmured about Thomas's temper and Linda's tears. And along the lake, neighbors shook their heads and said they'd always wondered how the family afforded so much on so little. At the hardware store, someone overheard Thomas telling the manager that I had blindsided them, that I had destroyed the family. But the manager, who had known me since I was in middle school, responded with a question Thomas couldn't answer. Why was she paying for it in the first place? My cousin Molly told me that moment spread through town like wildfire. Meanwhile, Olivia's influencer world was collapsing just as quickly. Her brand partners began dropping her one-by-one emails arriving with curt subject lines like termination of agreement and contract ended, due to non-payment. People noticed her absence from social media. Her once flawless feed turned quiet. And when she finally posted a vague message about a family crisis, the comments were relentless. What happened to all your partnerships? Why haven't you posted sponsored content? Is it true your sister paid for your stuff? She turned off comments within hours. The cracks in the facade she'd built, glittery, curated, polished, were widening into chasms. My phone buzzed with message after message from Ridgewater, each one revealing another piece of the truth unraveling. Mrs. Whitaker told me she overheard two women at the cafe discussing how my parents had leaned on me for years. Another neighbor emailed saying she was sorry she hadn't known how much I'd carried. Recognition came in small waves, late but sincere. Then came the call I had expected. Thomas. His voice was raw, like he'd been yelling for hours. Rachel, if you don't fix this, we're going to lose everything. I'm not fixing it, I said. You don't get to decide that, he snapped. You owe us. I almost laughed. For what? For everything we did for you, he shouted. I let the silence hang between us. He sputtered, struggling to find footing he no longer had. The bank won't help. They said the guarantor is gone. You did this. No, I said quietly. Your spending did this. Linda took the phone, then her voice trembling. Honey, the house, the memories. We raised you there. And I saved it before I said. That doesn't mean I have to save it now. She sniffled loudly, then fell silent. Finally, Olivia's voice came through the phone, brittle and small. Rachel, I'm scared. A strange ache tugged at me. Not pity, not guilt. Something closer to sadness for her, for the child she never learned to stop being, for the adult she never learned to become. But that sadness didn't change my resolve. You're going to have to figure it out, I said. The way I did. The line went quiet. I hung up first. I sat in the stillness of my apartment, feeling the echo of the conversation settle like dust. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. I felt steady, grounded in a way I hadn't been since I was a teenager. Their lives were collapsing because I wasn't holding the beams up anymore. And it wasn't my job to stand there with my arms up, straining beneath the weight of their denial. 2 days later, I received an email from the Ridgewater bank manager. He'd forwarded the official update: the lake house will be listed for auction at the end of the month. I stared at the words, letting them sink deep. The house where I had spent summers swimming, winters wrapped in blankets, birthdays, anniversaries, arguments, disappointments, it was slipping into someone else's hands. It no longer mattered how many memories were tied to it. That house wasn't home anymore. It was a monument built on my sacrifices. And now, without those sacrifices, it was finally collapsing. That evening, just as I was pouring myself a glass of water, a soft knock echoed through my apartment. I frowned, set the glass down, and walked to the door. When I opened it, Olivia stood there, mascara-smudged hair, tangled suitcase shaking in her hand. Rachel. she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know where else to go. Olivia stood there in the hallway, clutching the handle of her suitcase so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes were swollen, her mascara trailing down her cheeks in uneven streaks. She looked nothing like the perfectly curated version of herself she had presented to Ridgewater, to her followers, to our family. She looked real frightened, exhausted, and stripped of the glossy armor she had worn for years. I stepped aside silently. She entered without a word. The moment she crossed the threshold, her composure crumbled. She sank onto my couch, burying her face in her palms, as her whole body shook with soundless sobs. I stood a few feet away, unsure whether to approach or keep the distance I had fought so hard to create. Finally, she whispered through trembling fingers, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Her voice cracked on every word. She looked up at me with eyes that were no longer defiant, no longer jealous, no longer cushioned by Dad's praise. I didn't know where else to go, she said. No one will talk to me. The brands dropped me. Dad won't stop yelling. Mom cries all day. The house, everything. It's falling apart. I crossed my arms gently over my chest, grounding myself. I told you this would happen. She nodded slowly, shame settling in her features. I know you did. I just didn't believe it. Dad always said the house would be ours forever, that you'd help if we needed it, that you'd always be there. I inhaled deeply through my nose. The word always clawed at something old and tender inside me. That was the problem, I said. He believed I would always sacrifice for everyone else. Olivia wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Dad said you were strong enough to handle it. That you didn't need as much as I did. I sank onto the opposite chair. Needing and deserving aren't the same thing. She stared at her hands. I didn't deserve it, Rachel. I see that now. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It wasn't cold. It was strange, like standing in a room where the furniture had been rearranged, where the shapes were familiar, but no longer in the same places. After a long moment, Olivia whispered, I don't know how to fix anything. I don't even know how to start. I studied her carefully, letting the truth settle in my mind before saying it aloud. You fix it by taking responsibility for your career, for your life, for the choices you made while pretending everything was perfect. Her chin trembled, but she nodded. And I added softly, You fix it without expecting me to clean it up for you. That last part seemed to land hardest. Her shoulders sagged, her gaze dropping to the floor. I'm not asking you to save me, she murmured. I'm asking you if I can stay here for a little while, just until I figure things out. I don't want to be in that house right now. I didn't answer immediately. I thought of Ridgewater's whispers of the foreclosure notice of Dad yelling in the bank lobby. I thought of all the years Olivia had basked in praise I funded, and all the nights I had gone without sleep so she could shine. I thought of the December evening when Dad called me a failure and Olivia smiled quietly beside him. But I also thought of the girl sitting in front of me now, small, frightened, humbled. A girl who finally saw herself without distortion. Just for a little while, I said at last. This isn't a permanent solution. Her eyes lifted, filled with something new, gratitude maybe, or humility. Thank you, she whispered. I nodded and stood. I'll make up the guest room. When I returned from putting fresh sheets on the bed, I found her staring at a framed photo on my kitchen counter, one of me standing outside the Seattle office building last year, smiling, holding the certificate from my promotion. It was one of the few photos of myself that I displayed. You look proud in this, she said softly. I was. I never congratulated you, she murmured. I didn't even ask about it. No, I replied. You didn't. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She just held the frame a moment longer before setting it back down gently. Later, as she settled into the guest room, she paused in the doorway. Rachel? Yeah. She hesitated. The proud, performative confidence she'd always worn was gone entirely. "I know you don't trust me right now," she said quietly. "But I want to change. I want to grow up. I'm tired of pretending everything's perfect." For a moment, I just watched her, the soft vulnerability in her voice, the fear of being turned away, the quiet hope that I might believe her. "Then start," I said. "But not for me. For yourself." She nodded, swallowing hard. Then she closed the door gently. I sat alone on the couch afterward, the apartment suddenly too quiet. I could hear her moving softly in the next room, unpacking her things. For the first time since Christmas dinner, my body wasn't tight with anger or bitterness. Instead, I felt a strange, reluctant tenderness, thin as thread but real. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. As the night settled in around us, my phone buzzed with a message from Ridgewater. "Thomas Moore just visited the bank again. He's not doing well." I stared at the screen. The storm wasn't over. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't standing in the rain anymore. I was watching it from a place where my feet were finally dry. I woke the next morning to the soft rattle of pans in the kitchen. For a moment I lay still, listening. It had been years since someone else moved around my apartment that early. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I found Olivia standing at the stove, staring down at a pan of scrambled eggs that looked more like yellow rubble. She turned quickly when she heard me. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I thought I'd make breakfast." She grimaced at the eggs. "But apparently, I've forgotten how." A small, unexpected smile tugged at my face. "It's okay. Thank you for trying." She exhaled, relieved that I wasn't snapping at her. I wanted to do something. We sat at the kitchen counter with the least burnt portion of her attempt and 2 cups of coffee. Olivia picked at her food, her shoulders curled inward. "I don't know who I am without all the noise," she said quietly. "Without Dad cheering me on, without followers online, without everything looking perfect." I sipped my coffee slowly. That can be a good thing. Stripped-down versions of ourselves are the most honest. Her eyes flickered. For a moment she looked younger, like the sister who used to share blankets with me during thunderstorms. "I don't know how to start over." "You start small," I said. "You stop pretending, and you stop waiting for someone else to fix things." She nodded, absorbing every word like she was afraid to miss something. Late that morning I received a call from Caroline. "Your parents are coming apart at the seams," she said. Thomas yelled at the bank manager again. Linda broke down in front of the mortgage clerk. "The foreclosure auction is spreading through town like wildfire." "I figured it would," I replied. "You should also know," she continued, "that people in Ridgewater aren't shocked at you for stepping back. They're shocked it took this long." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. After the call, Olivia approached me, twisting her fingers nervously. "I need to tell you something," she said. I set my phone aside. "Go ahead." She drew a shaky breath. "The sponsorships I lost, they weren't just because of missed payments. Some brands dug into my spending. They figured out things weren't adding up. A few discovered that I had claimed to be independent when you were paying for everything." I closed my eyes briefly. "Olivia." "I know," she whispered. "I lied. I told people I was self-made when the truth is, I was made on your sacrifice. And Dad never corrected me. He encouraged it." I stayed silent, conflicted. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said quickly. "I just needed you to know I see it now, all of it." Her voice cracked as she added, "I'm sorry for letting him erase you." The apology landed differently from the ones I'd heard before. This one wasn't frantic or manipulative or drenched in desperation. It felt real. That afternoon, after Olivia retreated to the guest room to fill out job applications, I sat down on the couch and let the quiet settle in. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "Rachel, this is Pastor Reynolds. Your father came by earlier. He seems lost. If you can reach out, even briefly." I stared at the message for a long time. Lost. The word didn't match the man I grew up with. He had been loud, forceful, unyielding, his voice always the one that set the tone in the house. The idea of him wandering into a pastor's office looking for direction felt surreal, but not enough to make me break my boundaries. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the blinds, letting winter sunlight stream into the apartment. Dust floated in the beam, moving slowly like tiny drifting stars. There was a stillness inside me I had never felt before. That evening, Olivia knocked on my door again. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded. She sat beside me, knees pulled to her chest. "I got an interview," she said. "Administrative assistant. Not glamorous. But it's something." "That's good," I said. "You need steady ground." She bit her lip. "I'm scared. I've never done anything without Dad telling me it was okay." I glanced at her. "Then this will be good for you." "I hope so," she whispered. We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Do you think Mom and Dad will be okay?" After the house is gone, I took a long breath. They might hit bottom. But maybe that's what they need. Maybe losing control is the only way they'll finally face the truth. Olivia nodded slowly, absorbing that. Just before bed, she paused in the hallway. "Rachel." "Yes." Her voice was fragile. "When this is all over, do you think we could be sisters again?" The question hit someplace deep, someplace tender and bruised. "I think," I said softly, "if we both keep doing the work, we might get there." She exhaled shakily, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. Not the camera-ready kind. A real one. She whispered goodnight and closed her door. I stood alone for a moment, the apartment warm and quiet. Outside, snow fell in slow, lazy flakes. Relief and exhaustion settled into my bones, but beneath them something new. Something calm. Something like healing. But as I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed again on the counter. A message from Ridgewater. "Your parents received the final auction date. They're falling apart. You should know. They're asking for you." The message about my parents asking for me sat on my phone like a weight one I wasn't sure I wanted to pick up. I stared at the screen long enough that the brightness dimmed, reflecting my own tired eyes back at me. For years, their needs had governed my choices. Now I had the power to pause, to breathe, to decide what I wanted without fear or guilt. I didn't reply. 2 days later, I found myself driving toward Ridgewater anyway. I told myself it was for closure, for clarity, for the final step in releasing the version of myself who had carried them for most of her life. The highway stretched long and gray beneath the winter sky, the snow on the shoulders melting into slush. Olivia stood in the driveway as I loaded my bag into the car that morning. She had put on a coat that was far too thin for the weather. "Are you going to see them?" she asked. I nodded. "Do you want me to come?" "No," I said gently. "This part is mine." She nodded with understanding I never thought she'd be capable of. "Be careful. And if they say anything that hurts you, remember you don't owe them anything." "I know," I said softly. "But maybe I owe myself a goodbye." When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house didn't look the way it used to. It wasn't the place hung with Christmas lights or filled with laughter and noise. The shutters were closed. The walkway was half shoveled. The wreath on the door sagged under melting snow. It looked like a home trying to hold itself together when everything inside it had already fallen apart. I knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. My mother stood there wearing a sweater I recognized from years ago, the one she used to wear when money was tight and she pretended everything was fine. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice hoarse. "Rachel," she whispered. I stepped inside. The house felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Dad sat at the dining table, hunched forward, staring at a pile of papers he didn't even try to hide. I recognized the foreclosure notices, the letters from the bank, the warnings. He didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his face was lined in ways I didn't remember, as if the last few weeks had aged him more than the last few years. "Rachel?" he said, his voice thin and brittle. "You came." I did. We stood there in the heavy silence that belonged to years of things unsaid. Mom motioned to the chair across from him. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. Dad cleared his throat, but no sound came out. He tried again. "I know I said things at Christmas. Things I shouldn't have said. Things that hurt you." I didn't respond. I didn't think he continued. "I didn't understand what you were carrying. I didn't see it." "You refused to see it," I said quietly. His shoulders sagged. "Maybe I did." Mom wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. "We've been losing everything these past few weeks, and all we could think about was how we pushed the one person who ever held us up." Another silence settled in the room. Dad finally spoke again, but his voice was nothing like the man who once dominated every table, every conversation. "We came to depend on you. Too much. We leaned on you so hard we never noticed you were breaking." My throat tightened. "And I'm sorry," he finished. The words drifted across the table, thin, fragile, honest. I didn't know how to catch them. For a long moment I just sat there, letting the apology settle. It wasn't enough to rewrite the past. It wasn't enough to erase the years of being dismissed, ignored, used. But it was something. A beginning, maybe. "I'm not here to fix the house," I said finally. "I'm not here to pay for anything." Dad nodded, his jaw tight with acceptance. "We know. I'm not here to save any of you." "We know," they both echoed. "I'm here because I needed to see that you understand I'm not coming back to that role." Dad lowered his head. "We do." I stood slowly. Mom made a small sound in her throat, like she wanted to reach out but wasn't sure if she was allowed. Dad didn't stand. He just looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time in years. "You deserved better than what we gave you," he whispered. "I know." I stepped toward the door. Mom followed. "Will we see you again?" she asked quietly. Maybe I said honestly. But things will be different. I walked out, the cold air stinging my cheeks. When I reached the car, I felt a strange release, like a tight knot in my chest had started to loosen. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. When I returned to Seattle later that evening, Olivia met me at the door. "How was it?" she asked. "Necessary," I said. She nodded and hugged me gently, hesitant, as if asking permission. I let her. That night, as I stood at my window watching the city lights flicker, I realized something important. Boundaries don't just protect you from others. They allow you to meet yourself again, to choose yourself again, to breathe again. If you've ever had to let go of a role that kept you small or walked away from a burden that wasn't yours, I hope this story reminds you that your peace is worth fighting for. And if it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, like the video if it spoke to you, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.